Hey, welcome back to the ClairAudioFiles with your host, me, Zahra Shakti. I am a radio producer, a DJ, a selector, an events producer, and so much more. And what I like to do on my podcast is really take the art of listening to the next level. I let my guests speak, and I really listen to the things that are not said, listening to the wisdom that's in silence. That's what I can say the Claire Audio Files is. So thank you for being here. I would like to introduce you to the second episode featuring a very, very special guest, Dr. Susan Rogers. If you haven't caught the first episode yet, that's okay. You don't have to watch them in order, but make sure that you catch that episode because in both of these segments, Susan shares some invaluable gems, many of which she hasn't actually shared before. As you'll hear many times, a lot of the questions that I asked her, she had never been asked to think about before. And so that was incredibly gratifying to get a first peek into her mind from specific angles and from specific questions. In this interview is a lot of information about her time working as an engineer and a producer for the one and only Prince. Everything that she had learned about cultivating your talents, knowing who you are. Susan is a very, very interesting, very generous, very thoughtful person. And speaking with her is not only really thought-provoking, but it's also a lot of fun. So I hope that you enjoy this interview. Please listen carefully to it. Give it your all. Give it your focus and your attention for that 45, 50 minutes that we talk. There is so much in there that can really be beneficial to your life, to your sense of yourself, and just to those who also you love and are around, who you could share this with. So without further ado, here is part 2 of my conversation with the one and only Susan Rogers. I hope you enjoy. You started the vault.
I do take responsibility for that because technically, yeah, I did.
Yes, you did.
I'm taking ownership of it.
Yes.
Anyone else can claim that they did it. So yeah, but it wasn't a big deal. If I had built a pyramid in Egypt or something like that, if it were a big deal, I'd be more hesitant. But it was just a natural thing that you would do in that position. So I joined him in '83, and I'm the new employee, and I'm his engineer, and he will very often ask for a certain tape, ask for something to be pulled, that's an unfinished work or just whatever, something he was playing around with. And I just needed to know where everything was. So one of the early tasks that I gave myself to do was just get all of his tapes all in one place and get them all cataloged so that when he asks for Bambi or any of these things that I've never heard of before, I can go right to it and I can find it. So I needed an organizational system. And that meant I needed to call around to recording studios that he had worked in, such as Sunset Sound in Los Angeles. I think Hollywood Sound Factory was one of them. There were a few places in Minneapolis, places where he had worked, and ask if they had any of his tapes in their tape closet. That was customary for recording studios. They just hang onto the tape for you. I had to get all those sent back home to Minneapolis, then talk with his staff, his office staff, about a labeling scheme, a numerical scheme that would allow us to catalog all these things. And then we had to find a place to store them until ultimately Paisley Park Studios was built. So we needed a temperature controlled environment. Minneapolis has those great temperature swings, 4 very distinct seasons. So we found this records facility, and all of that body of work was pretty big by the time Paisley Park Studios was being designed. There were a hell of a lot of tapes. So in the blueprints of Paisley Park Studios, it was determined that there would be our own storage facility down in the basement that could serve as a storm shelter, and that would be a vault. Prince wanted we called it the vault, so he wanted it to look like a vault. He wanted the bank door on there with the big round wheel like you see in banks. And
Yeah.
so that's what we did.
Wow. Did Prince have a sharp memory?
Yes, he did. Yes, he
Okay.
did. And I say that with exasperation because if you ever made a mistake or whatever, he wouldn't let you forget it. Yeah, he remembered.
Okay. Okay. What about with regards to his own ideas and um
Yeah, yeah, kind of. I mean, for the most part, yes. It was very sweet. I remember early in my time with him, we were at rehearsal and practicing for well, just all the things, the stuff on that went on the Purple Rain album and practicing for the movie. Anyway, he was at the piano and he played something. I think the rest of the band was taking a break, but he was sitting at the piano and he played something and he looked up and he says, "That's pretty." And then he said, "Is that mine?" He didn't know if he had already written that or not. And he kind of
Mm,
laughed, but so yeah, there was so much music coming out of him. Sometimes he didn't necessarily remember if he had written that before or not. But
mhm,
that was rare. That was rare. Most of the time, he knew.
mhm. And he was so adamant about, I think, getting immediately to the idea, to the groove, to the recording that it was like not much was needed to even sit down and remember.
It's very true. Yeah. As
Yeah.
soon as a song came to his head, it's not like he sang it into a dictation recorder or did a little demo, which many like most artists do. He just went right to the studio because he always had a studio within arm's reach. He went right to the studio and began recording, which
Mm,
meant that his engineer, me in the 80s, could get a call anytime, morning, noon, or night, that he wants to go in the studio now.
mhm, mhm. Whew. Um, I have been so curious about what prompted, what was the genesis of Paisley Park itself as an idea, for him?
Mm.
Because I think it's a really, it was built when he was still relatively young.
I think the impetus was entirely practical. So
Mhm,
when I joined him, we were rehearsing at a warehouse in St. Louis Park, Minneapolis. This is a little suburb of Minneapolis. But you're renting these places. They're not ideal. Security's non-existent. And then I think we lost the lease, or for one reason, we got out of the St. Louis Park place and we went to another rehearsal spot on Flying Cloud Drive, and then we lost the lease on that. And then we went to a third one, and he couldn't be dealing with that anymore. And at this point, especially after Purple Rain, fans were starting to kind of show up. So he needed the security. He needed a place of his own where he wouldn't lose the lease. And so early on, I think with the money from the success of Purple Rain, he started planning, let's build our own place. Now, calling it Paisley Park, I don't know for sure, but I think around the time of the Around the World in a Day album, he was dating Susanna Melvoin, and Wendy and Lisa were in his band. And Susanna and Wendy and Lisa, all of them were turning him on to music that he hadn't known or really didn't know well prior, like the Beatles and a lot of stuff from the 60s, the Rolling Stones, and certainly Jimi Hendrix and Led Zeppelin and stuff like that. And I think the Paisley theme, which was so popular in the 1960s, was just cool. To him, it was just cool. So I'm sure that the name Paisley Park came to him in a burst of inspiration, and it stuck. It's a good name for the place.
it is. It's a great name. Okay. We haven't talked enough about you yet, which
Mm,
I always intended to do. Um, because your life is so, I think your life is very inspiring.
thank you.
Um, and if you can maybe give again for the folks who are listening, your origin story, where do you come from? And then your trajectory into the music industry, because you've basically been working in the music industry your whole working life.
Mm. I'm
Yeah.
from Southern California,
Hmm.
Anaheim, California, to be precise. I was born in 1956, lower middle class family. My dad was an exterminator, pest control, and my mom was a housewife for the most part, but my mother had poor health. So after many, many years of battling cancer, she passed away when I was 14. I'm the oldest, and I'm the only girl in my family. I have three younger brothers, which ended up being really useful preparation for the music business, for working with mostly men. I'm comfortable with them. I've got a lot of brothers. So yeah, I grew up like most kids. We didn't have a lot of money, but it was a good family, people who had good values, and we took care of one another. That was the only strife in our family. Like there wasn't any other strife other than my mother's illness, which is just something that happens in this life. Anyway, as a child, I was just crazy about music. Still am to this day, but all my fantasies and my spare time and any little babysitting money or birthday money might have, I would spend on records because I just was crazy about it. And I kind of knew, I said earlier in our conversation that I believe that children know who they are. And I loved music, but the thought of being a musician or a songwriter or a performer on stage, it didn't feel right to me at all. It held zero attraction. However, the thought of contributing in some way to those artists who are making records, that felt very exciting to me at a very young age, 8, 9, 10 years old.
Hmm.
I think I was born to be a record maker because it was just kind of a natural fit for me. It's not something I fell into. It was a light on the inside that I followed. Um, I After my mother passed away, it was very difficult for my family. It was really difficult for many reasons, and it was kind of every man for himself. College was absolutely not an option. There were no professional people in my family, and no one with a higher education, so that wasn't going to happen. So when I was 17, I dropped out of high school, just quit, just walked away, and got married to a guy who was 4 years older than me. I was 17, he was 21. And then we got married, and that ended up being out of the frying pan and into the fire because he was a really terrible person, really terrible, and used to be really jealous of my love for music, especially. I mean, just raging jealous of it. So when I was 21 myself, after 4 years of this terrible marriage, I managed to escape, which is the appropriate word. And then I moved with a friend to Hollywood and started my career, and I must say my life in 1978. Now I'm 21 years old, and my life is now mine, and it belongs just to me. And I'm going to make something out of it, and I'm gonna contribute to records in whatever way I can. I never dreamed that I could be an engineer or, God forbid, a producer, because there were no women. You just didn't see any women's names back in those days. But I knew there was something I could do and be good at and that was I can study. I like studying, and I like learning, and I like technology, and I like mechanics. Just got a feel for it. So I studied electronics, and I became an audio technician. And there I was. I was a young woman in my 20s in Hollywood repairing studio consoles and tape machines. That's when the call came through the professional grapevine that Prince was looking for a technician. And there you go. I mean, that was my dream job. He was my favorite artist in the world. He wanted a technician. I was a technician. He liked working with women. I was one, and I was the perfect fit.
That's what I'm saying, it's like it's almost like destiny because you know, I just think it's so incredible that you were how old, 25, 26 when you started working with him?
I had just celebrated my 27th birthday,
Okay.
and he had just turned 25.
Like most people around that age begin their careers,
Mm.
or are just starting out their careers. And so were you. And here you go. Like I've heard you say that if you could write down what your dream job was, it was to work with Prince. And then you get this call. It's just so wonderful. Like, wow.
Yeah, I got very, very fortunate because I teach students now who want to have careers themselves. There's a lot of thinking that needs to go into this
Mm.
this career path if you aren't so fortunate as to have fortune find you. So there's always strategy involved. And I think of the two things that I had going that allowed fortune to find me is one, I knew what I wanted, and two, I knew who I was. So I think your best chance of success are when you can take the raw material of who you are. Here's my skills and abilities. Here's how I think. Here's where my natural abilities lie. This is who I am. And you can find the overlap in the Venn diagram of who you are with what you want. Then the odds are good that things will work out for you. What I am is a person who likes the technical stuff. That's why I'm a neuroscientist today. I love that
Mm.
more than anything. It's my favorite thing. I like the technical stuff, and what I wanted was to contribute to records being made. There's a place for a person who wants that. There's a place, and it doesn't matter if you're female in a male-dominated environment. We want you. You're a good fit. You're not going to change your mind. You're going to stick with it, as in one way or another I've done. What I occasionally see with students is they often have big dreams and desires and wants that aren't in alignment with their what appears to be their natural or their unnatural, their abilities. And that there's a separation in that Venn diagram there. And then I think they're going to struggle harder.
Do you see there being a way to bridge, to create that overlap?
Yeah, I think the best way is know yourself.
Mm.
And the best way to know yourself is to spend time with yourself. I just heard this described the other day, that young people today are tied to the railroad tracks by social media. Tied by social media. And there's this 200-mile-an-hour mental crisis train headed right toward them because, I'll go ahead and say where I heard it, the magician Penn Jillette from Penn and Teller. I love his podcast. I've been listening to it for years.
Mm.
Anyway, he was saying this. He's got two teenagers, a 16-year-old and a 17-year-old. And he was saying, he said, when I was young, he says, when I was a teenager in Greenfield, Massachusetts, I taught myself to juggle, and I could juggle 3 balls. And he said, and in my circle of people who I knew, I was the only person I knew personally who could juggle 3 balls. And I really thought that was a very special talent and skill. And I was pretty damn special because I was the only one who could do this, at least among the circle of people I know. He said, today, my kid, my 16-year-old, can juggle 3 balls. And all he has to do is go to social media and see that there are 20 million kids out there who can juggle 3 balls. He said, my son tends to lack confidence in some areas because he doesn't think he can do anything that's all that great. He might learn to play guitar, and then he sees that there's a 6-year-old doing Van Halen riffs. There's a 4-year-old that's juggling better than he does. So, yeah, I kind of went off on a tangent there, but we do need to get away from the social media and from screens on occasion and spend time just activating our default network, which is a brain network. That's where you go when you go into your own head, and let your brain show you who you are and tell you what you want. It'll tell you what you want because it'll show you what your fantasies are. My fantasies always involved some sort of recording studio or being around musicians, not being one myself. That's how I knew who I was. I wouldn't have been good at music business. I wouldn't have been a good manager. I wouldn't have been a good record executive, but I knew technical stuff, I'm your girl. Put me on that, and that I could do. So I don't know. I think it does come from your daydreaming and your fantasies and knowing yourself and not comparing yourself to everyone else who's out there. Goodness, if I'd compared myself to every technician who was out there, I never would have taken a step out the door because all the technicians were men. They didn't look anything like me, and the vast majority of them had gone to college and they had an education, a formal education in electronics engineering, which I didn't have. So I didn't fit the bill at all.
Mm.
But I had raw ability and I had desire.
And you had the awareness of that. You had the awareness that you had that.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
from self-examination, you know, just from spending time with myself, long walks and daydreaming. And daydreaming is very undervalued, uh,
Yeah.
very undervalued. It's very important for us.
Yeah, you talk about that in your book. I think it's in the final chapter. And there was a passage that I was re-listening to that chapter today, and I again I've heard you talk about this in interviews as well. So I know it's an important concept. What I learned from hearing you talk about it was, okay, it was a bit of comfort because I'm kind of a daydreamer myself,
Good.
very much so. And with the social media, with the work, with being an adult, and sometimes listening too much to those outer voices, you can forget or disconnect from that inner child or that inner essence, which is, I think,
Mhm.
most
Mhm.
potent when you're a child,
Oh,
as you said. But yeah, I was re-listening to the that passage on daydreaming, that there are benefits to it, that even from a neurological level, you know, that there are certain pathways that open up in your brain, or from a biological level, pathways that open up in your brain that can activate um, other networks and stimuli that can actually be of great benefit to your life.
so a hot topic in neuroscience right now is creativity. And um, and also this thing called the default network. And the two things are related. So the default network is several nuclei in the brain that are interconnected, and each one of them, there's the insula, the nucleus accumbens, the caudate nucleus, there's a few of these things, and they're interconnected with each other, and they are either solely or partially responsible for our sense of self, self-consciousness, self-awareness, self-image, which of course develops over the course of our life. We're constantly revising our own notion of who we think we are. But anyway, it's so cool because that network is the network that turns on when we're not focused on external stimuli. So when you're not looking at your phone, when you're not looking at a TV monitor, when you're not listening to me right now, when you're not focused on an external stimulus, something you hear or smell or taste or touch or see, you go into your own head. And according to researchers, we're doing that 30 to 50% of the time if we're being honest. And if we're not being honest, it's probably more like 50 to 70% of the time. That's what a brain does. It goes outside, inside, outside, inside. That's what it does. Now, I mentioned creativity. The neuroscience of creativity is showing us that creativity is the end result of spontaneous thought. Spontaneous thought is what happens when you go into your own head and you let yourself think whatever you want to think. It happens when we're dreaming, of course. That's spontaneous thought because you can't control it. It just, your brain goes wherever it's going to go. And sometimes it goes to really weird places. But when you're awake, and it says, oh, maybe says, I'm bored right now, or I don't know what to think, or I've got a problem that I know is kind of simmering under there. I should think about that problem. And you go into your own head, that private place that only you know. You're just playing, really. I mean, you're just letting different patterns of neural activation act themselves out. So you're imagining different futures. What if I called him? What if instead of calling him, I just texted him? What if I got up extra early tomorrow morning and I did this and I did that? And there's your brain spontaneously wandering around different scenarios. And as it's doing this wandering around, it might just hit upon a good idea. And it might just say, yes, yes, that is good. I want that. I need that. And then you're going to move from spontaneous thought to goal-directed thought. You're going to, if you're a writer, you're going to grab that laptop, or you're going to grab that pencil and paper. You're going to do whatever it is you need to do. You're going to grab that guitar, sit at that keyboard, and you're going to make that germ come to life. You're going to build something. You're going to make something. So yeah, that's the neuroscience of the default network in very loose terms, but going into our own heads, daydreaming and mind wandering,
Mhm.
give birth to creative thought. You can bet that Steve Jobs of Apple Computer was a hell of a mind wanderer. You can bet that anyone who is a great artist or inventor is a mind wanderer.
Hmm. So it's safe to say that Prince was a mind wanderer?
Oh, he must have been.
Yeah.
He must have been. Now, there are some people, it's very rare, but there are some people who are what neuroscience identifies as being a hypercreative, and they actually have a couple of impaired circuits in the right hemisphere, not in the default network, but in circuits that communicate with the default network. And by impaired, I mean they lack the brakes, the inhibition that most of us have. And what that means is their creative ideas just keep coming and coming and coming and coming.
Mhm.
They have ideational fluency, and they're very flexible in their thinking. So the ideas keep coming, and if they hit a stumbling block or a problem that's unsolvable or something isn't working out, they're flexible. They have many, many ways of going around it. That's hyper creativity. I think I've only known two. I've only actually seen or been in the room with two people who've exhibited hyper creativity my whole time in the music business. And one was Prince.
Are there certain personality traits or certain maybe like open-mindedness we can assume comes with that? Or is it, yeah?
There
Okay.
are, yeah, there are some things that are comorbid with high creativity, um, that is packaged along with creativity. And some of them are not all that pleasant to have. A tendency toward depression is
Mm.
one. Um, the social isolation isn't a character trait, but you have to, if you're very creative, you have to be able to cope with being a little bit of an odd duck and being socially isolated. You have to have the strength of character to put up with a lot of rejection. I mean, actors get rejected almost on a daily basis. Actors and comedians, comedians get heckled. Imagine being heckled while you're at work doing your job. Imagine
Mm.
people booing you or saying nasty things about you. So, yeah, um, creative people get rejected a lot, and they have to be tough enough to be able to handle that. So, yeah, to be creative is, according to neuroscientists, the definition of creativity, or rather, the description of it includes you have to be productive, meaning you have to make stuff. You can't just be telling others that you're really creative. You have to actually have to prove it. So you have to be productive. The things you make need to be original. That kind of goes without saying, but it does need to be said. You're not being creative if you're imitating things that have come before.
Mhm.
And the last thing is an important one. The stuff you make has to be useful. It has to be stuff that needs to be made, because the creativity has a lot of neural overlap with schizophrenia. And folks with schizophrenia and disorders like that may say something or do something or draw something that's truly original, but it's if it's just nonsense, if it's not something that needs to be done, like, taking the lid off a trash can and having a conversation with a banana peel that's in there, that wouldn't count as creativity. That wouldn't count. So yeah, those are the three bullet points that need to be met to qualify as creative.
I'm very curious about Prince's ability to lead a band, being as highly creative as he was, as it sounds somewhat demanding, and I'm not putting a negative or positive inflection on that. That's just sort of an assessment, demanding. He himself had so much energy and stamina, your sessions would be anywhere from like 12 to 72 hours long straight. Yeah. And you, I can imagine, didn't get very much sleep in the 4 or 5 years you worked.
Not much.
How was he able to really keep people sticking within his vision? Or how did he deal with it when it didn't happen, when it became maybe too demanding, or if people had resistance or there were issues that came up? It just seemed that
Now I'm smiling because I got my answer ready. Yeah.
go for it.
Yeah, people knew what he valued them for. Mark Brown knew what, I mean, just like little children do with their parents, you know, the actions that you take, the behaviors you engage in that get the praise and the reward from your teacher or your parents or your friends. And so anything that is rewarded, you tend to repeat it. So Matt Fink and Bobby and Mark Brown and other people who played in Prince's Circle, whether it's Sheila E. or members of the time, they knew what to do that would make him happy. But the reason I was smiling just now is the one who was always pushing back was Wendy Melvoin. Wendy
Oh,
Melvoin was always pushing back, in part because she's such a brilliant artist, and she just had such love for him and such confidence that she would want to pull things in her direction. Now, Prince was smart enough to recognize that Wendy and Lisa's talent was enormous. And so often when Wendy and Lisa wanted to fan out his music, he'd go ahead and let them do it because they were improving it. And his music wasn't the same after the revolution broke up. It wasn't the same. Without Wendy and Lisa, without their unique touch, it was different.
mhm.
So yeah, Prince was open-minded, and in most cases, if Wendy or Lisa, usually it was the two of them together, if they wanted to pull his music in a certain direction, he was open-minded to it. But if he decided no, it's not going to go that way, then it would be no.
And so how would I'm so curious about how the band communicated ideas like that and however else when they were working together musically.
Yeah, so often at rehearsal, when he had, well, this must have been hard for him now that I think about it. But when he had a new musical idea, new song in his head, he just wanted, he was capable of, and he just wanted to go in the studio and just get it done, just put it down. But there were a lot of pieces that he was only too happy to bring to rehearsal and have the arrangement be performed by his band. So they'd have the basic groove that would be laid down, and they might change the tempo or they might not, but the basic groove was there, and he knew the chord changes, he knew the melody, and then he'd let them go ahead and take it, find the timbres, I mean, the keyboard patches, find the sounds, find the parts that you want. If he heard something that inspired him, which he frequently did, he would encourage them. Yes, 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 that's good, keep on with that. Or if something wasn't working, he'd let a musician work it out for themselves and then say, no, why don't you try this? Why don't you try that? So
Mm,
the pushback that might come would be when he wouldn't like something that maybe Wendy or Lisa or Matt or Bobby was doing, and that he would want them to do something else. And
mhm.
the ones who pushed back were Wendy and Lisa, mostly Wendy.
Okay, okay. Um, so I'm guessing that you were able to see the creation and then the follow through process of a lot of music. Can you describe, was that process repetitive or did it have certain elements to it? Was it kind of whenever the inspiration came, did it change? Is that question clear?
Yeah, I think, do you mean the methodology of actually doing the recording, or do you mean the process of taking something from the original idea through?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, the second question.
So his ideas came all the time. They were coming all the time, and usually they came to him when he was alone and he was mind wandering, when he was doing his daydreaming or his creative thought. I mean, he said, I know of many examples where he said ideas came to him when he was brushing his teeth. So he
Mm,
doing the most mundane things when you're free to let your mind just drift and wander. He'd get an idea for a song, and then we'd have to be in the studio right away. Occasionally, it would happen at rehearsal, and those were beautiful moments when it happened because he was so happy. So sometimes he loved to play, and so he wanted to be playing every single day. And at rehearsal with the band, everybody there in Minneapolis, they'd play. He would often get to rehearsal early, and he'd maybe get up on the riser and he'd program a new drum beat or whatever. So by the time the band walked in, there'd already be the germ or at least the rhythm of a new song. But other times, they'd just fool around and play some James Brown or play some Parliament or just play some Tower of Power or just whatever.
mhm,
Just play, and then he's listening for He's listening for a seed. He's listening for that thought that's going to turn into a new song. And when it would happen, when somebody would play something that would strike him as, yeah, this is a new song, that was really great watching that come together.
Mm. What was the recording session of America like?
Let me see. Remember now that this was 35 years ago, but I do remember some things about it. We were at the warehouse at Flying Cloud Drive, nice big warehouse. That was my favorite of the three where we were. And I think it was Princess too. It was the best one. So we were there. It was summertime, and at rehearsal, all of the microphones on the stage fed a splitter snake, meaning the microphones then could go to two different recording or two different consoles. One was a recording console, the one that I operated, and the other was a monitor mix console, just so the band could hear themselves on stage. So I had my recording console there, and I had my tape machine and my outboard gear and my speakers, and the band ran through it to get their parts and their sounds and everything right, and put up fresh tape, pressed record, and they played until the tape ran out, which in those days, at that speed we were running, it's about 16, 17 minutes long. We had to stop because the tape ran out. So we did it was a live recording for all intents and purposes. I don't remember what overdubs we might have done. We probably did a little bit of polishing it up. He typically did that, but it was a live recording at the warehouse. Fun. It was a fun one.
Yeah, yeah. Because I remember the first time I have the 12-inch right here, and it's that like 18, 19-minute version on it. I remember the first time I heard it was hearing it on that. And I just was like, I think about halfway through the song, my brain was like, it was a record that I think really impacted the way I would listen to Prince moving forward.
Really?
Because
Why? How come?
because it goes in a very for me an incredible direction. It's so alive, musically, the way they're
Mm.
playing the music, it's so alive. And I'm a DJ, and for me, like, I would just want to play all 20 minutes, and if people don't like it, I'd be like, what's wrong with you? Because I love the dance. I love Prince's dance tracks, and this one is so like it just has, I don't know, it's just the feeling of it. Like, the first vocal, within the beginning, he has that scream.
Mm.
He screams. As soon as I hear that, I feel this life just come
Yeah,
inside of me from that, you know
yeah.
and it just repeats throughout the entire record. There's this life that's in it. It just is, wow.
That Around the World in a Day, I have a special spot in my heart for. I really love that album because it of the albums that I did with him, that was the one we recorded where he was the happiest. He was so damned happy because we recorded it. For the most part, most of the songs were recorded before the Purple Rain movie, before the Purple Rain album came out. So we didn't know. He didn't know that he was about to become a superstar. He just knew
Mm.
that it felt right. This was a really good time. He was with Susanna at that time. For the most part, he dated other people, but primarily he was with Susanna, and the band was good, and his fortunes were rising, and he was just happy as hell, happy as hell. And you can feel that a young man's optimism and joy and triumph, I think, on many of those songs. He also was willing to be open and a little bit vulnerable, in particular on Condition of the Heart, which is one of my favorite songs of his,
Mm.
lyrically especially. This was written when he wasn't yet in a monogamous relationship with Susanna. Susanna was with someone else at that time, and he really was crazy about her, and he let that be known on that record.
Mm.
We also get Prince's transition into speaking about an us and not just him. Purple Rain was a young man's record about himself and his life and his world. But after that came hugely successful. And I guess when he was anticipating it was going to be hugely successful, he was now willing to say, okay, I don't want to just talk about myself. I want to talk about us, the people who are my fans, the people who get me, the people who follow me. Um, there's us, there's Paisley Park, which is why he moved from the purple theme on the cover to kind of a rainbow palette of all of us. And that was a generosity of spirit that I liked in him.
So, what can you tell me about the artwork of this album?
Not much. Not much.
Okay.
I wasn't involved in those decisions in his life. He commissioned it. He had a basic idea, but I'm afraid I don't know much more about that. His life was quite compartmentalized. He discussed fashion with his fashion people and recording with his recording people, and he discussed business with his business people.
Hmm. And did people know not to inquire about certain things that were outside of their?
I don't know if I would say we knew not to inquire, but I know for me, I didn't.
Mhm.
I don't know. I don't think he ever forbade it or anything. I just, there was so much work to do.
Yeah.
And at that time, you worked so hard to please him, and you wanted to keep your job because it was great. And I don't imagine a lot of people, especially if they're working on his clothing or his photography or his album covers or his business, would ask him questions about the other areas of his life. I
Yeah.
don't know that that would have been well received, maybe, but I don't know. I
Mm.
didn't.
Hmm.
It
Hmm.
sounds like I was quite timid. I wouldn't call myself timid. I think I called myself at least partially aware of what I needed to do and who I needed to be in order to be ideal for him. In fact, our relationship ended when I was in Los Angeles doing post production on the Sign of the Times concert film, and he was in Minneapolis. And I met a guy. I met a guy who was technically helping with the movie, and I went on a date with him. First date I'd had in over 4 years. And Prince couldn't reach me that night because I was out on a date with Billy. And he came to Los Angeles. Prince came to Los Angeles the next day and was very angry that he couldn't reach me that night. So yeah, that's what I mean by saying, you stayed in your lane with him if you wanted to be in his good graces.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
what my lane included, I was a person who was available for his recording needs 24/7 every day of the week, every day of the year. That was the arrangement.
Yeah. And with all of that, also given the nature of your relationship and how you held yourself in your relationship, I can imagine it was a very close one. Actually, you can tell me, like, how would you describe the nature of your relationship?
Hmm. It's hard to put into words because he wasn't that talkative. He wasn't self-revealing. He saved everything for his music. So he didn't make small talk. He didn't have conversations about personal things. With girlfriends, maybe he did. With Wendy and Lisa, sure, certainly way more than he would have with me.
Mm.
But there was always a feeling between us. There was a feeling in the room, a feeling of love and affection and trust. Um, you can tell when a person is cold toward you or doesn't like you, and you can tell when a person is warm toward you and sympathetic and empathetic. And yeah, I felt, I felt close to him in our way. I felt really close. It was a wordless kind of relationship. Of course, on occasion we talked about personal things, but it wasn't very often. Um, but he knew I had his best interests in mind always, and he was grateful for that.
Mhm. What are you most proud of in your work with him?
Um, Most proud of, I suppose, the things that I mentioned earlier is a capacity to read him and be as close as I could manage, be what he needed. To be selfless, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. To be selfless, to not be thinking about myself and what I needed or what was in it for me. Because he had people in his employ who were looking out very heavily for what was in it for them.
Mm.
And that caused him some difficulty. I never did. I'm proud of the fact that when I left him, I never took anything from him that didn't belong to me. There were people who worked for him who stole from him, who took personal things, and not the people whose names we've mentioned, not the good people, but there were some people who just would take whatever they could get. And I'm very proud that I was never even tempted. I knew what I was there to do, and I did it, and I did it as well as I could. So I'm proud that I made those choices and behaved that way in his employ.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thank you for these wonderful questions. You're so good at this. I've been interviewed about him so many times, and I love that you asked questions I've never been asked before, and even got some old information, but through a new way of asking about it. And I appreciate you for that. Thank you very much.
I appreciate you, Susan. Thank you for indulging me with your time
Yeah.
and your knowledge. And it's such an honor to speak with you. And
Thank you.
thank you so much for everything that you've done. It's been a big part of my of just some very important moments in my life.
Thank you.
And you know, I wouldn't be here, I think, without that music.
Well, thank
So,
you. Not at
yeah.
all. And the pleasure was all mine, and the privilege. I've been pretty
Mm.
lucky in this world.
All the best, Susan. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Nice to see you.
Nice to
Bye.
meet you. Bye bye. So after that, we must be ready to go out and take on the world. I want to give a big thank you to Susan, who was so generous with her time, talking to me for upwards of 2 hours and giving me an insight into her incredible life and experience and just into her heart and who she is too. Thank you very much, Susan. It was an honor. If you like this interview, please don't hesitate to share it with someone who you think would find it interesting too. Definitely anyone who is a Prince lover would love this interview, but in general, an artist, entrepreneur, or just someone who is dedicated to expanding themselves and figuring out more about who they are in this life, which hopefully is people in your circle too. Please like and subscribe, share this podcast. Know that you can listen to it on Spotify, Apple, and also watch it and listen to it on YouTube. Make sure you follow the page, the ClairAudioFiles, as well as my personal page, Zahra.Shakti, and my radio show, Lunar.Rotations. All of this on IG. We're also on Twitch, twitch.tv/Zahra Shakti, and you can find out more of what we're up to in terms of events, podcasts, and many other cool and exciting projects. Please don't hesitate to get in touch too. You can drop me a line on those social media handles, on my email, and we'll talk to you real soon. Peace.